Intimate Judaism deals with sensitive topics and uses explicit language. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome back to Intimate Judaism. My name is Tali Rosenbaum.
And my name is Rabbi Scott Kahn. And today, Tali, we're going to deal with an issue that we talked about in an earlier episode, episode 8. In fact, one of our most popular episodes. It was entitled, Sex Within Marriage, What's Allowed and What's Not. Even though we dealt with that issue then, many people have contacted us because they have serious questions about the psychological and halachic ramifications of Outercourse.
Okay, well, I look forward to hearing what you have to say on that. I certainly have a lot to say about that.
Okay, but Tali, before we delve into that topic, I want to first congratulate you on the book which I'm holding in my hand, which you showed me right now for the first time, I Am For My Beloved, A Guide to Enhanced Intimacy for Married Couples by David S. Ribner and Tali Y. Rosenbaum. Congratulations on his publication.
Thank you very much. Thanks. I hope that the book is going to be available in Jerusalem beginning next week. It will be available on Amazon, but probably not until January.
Well, we're looking forward to reading it, and I know that you and I are going to have an episode where we're going to review this book, and I'll interview you and David Ribner about what you wrote in this book. So I'm looking forward to reading it myself. Before we delve into today's topic, Tali, we want to thank all of our listeners for listening to Intimate Judaism. We appreciate your sharing and promoting this podcast. Because of the sensitive topics that Tali and I discuss, we definitely appreciate your help letting people know about the podcast. So please share and help us get the word out. Make sure to visit our website, intimatejudaism.com, for the full podcast archive, show notes, a free men's mikveh list, and more. Please also continue to send us your questions and comments to intimatejudaism@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's intimatejudaism@jewishcoffeehouse.com. And because of those communications, we're able to know what you want to hear. And that's the reason that we're doing this episode today. Let's start off by talking about some of the communications we've received. I want to read you an email which I received about a month and a half, 2 months ago. The email reads as follows. I'm pregnant and my sex drive is in a weird state. I've been having a very strong urge to masturbate my husband. I know he is not allowed to do this to himself, but I'm wondering if there's any chance I'm allowed to do it to him, considering it's being done by me in a loving kind of way. So this person's obviously troubled by the desire to do something, which, according to what we've generally been taught in the Orthodox world, is not allowed. One is not allowed to ejaculate non-vaginally, even in the context of marriage. That's how people normally understand this issue. As I say, please go back to episode 8 where we deal with the halachic sources. I have a relatively extensive discussion there, extensive for a podcast, and we talk about what is allowed and what's not allowed. And much of what people think is prohibited, it's not exactly as clear-cut as they think. At the same time, we have to talk a little more about what actually is allowed and how people can deal with this.
I'm curious as to what your answer would be, certainly from a psychological point of view. Not even psychological, just from a general sexual health point of view. What it seems that this woman is describing is manual sex, using her hand to bring her husband to orgasm and ejaculation. It's a fairly normative, regular activity within the many, many, many different things that couples can do together in the context of sexual intimacy. We often think that sex is about intercourse, especially when we talk about it in terms of the context of halacha, which seems to specifically talk about bia, or the intercourse itself. But there are many, many different things that men and women can do together. They can have oral sex, they can have all sorts of touching of one another. And also, sex is not just about the genitals, it's the whole body is very erotic. And there are many, many things that couples can do together. And I think that what this woman is talking about is wanting to do this because she feels a desire to do it. There are many reasons why couples might want to engage in this type of sexual activity for many other reasons, some having to do with wanting to do it that way, and some having to do with needing to do it that way for whatever reasons.
Can you tell me more about what you mean when you say a couple needs to do it a different way?
Well, there are many different reasons why a couple may choose to engage in what we talked about before. We talked about the word outercourse, and outercourse would mean sex without necessarily penetration, but rather sex in other ways. And there are many reasons why couples may want to do that, either mindfully, intentionally, or it might just happen that way. I think we also need to say that there are couples that very much enjoy penetrative intercourse, and there are couples who enjoy other activities some of the time as well. There are also couples who may have difficulty with penetrative intercourse. There might be couples where the woman has, and this is quite common, some sort of sexual pain issue. Sexual pain is a pretty common problem, and it can affect up to 15% of women in their childbearing years. There are women who have difficulty with intercourse, and some of them have difficulty with intercourse from the beginning of the first time that they attempted to have intercourse, and it was painful. Many women develop a reactive response. It's known as vaginismus, where it's kind of like an anxiety response to penetrative sex because of fear and because of pain. So pain can also be because of vulvodynia or localized vestibulitis. These are big words that basically mean the vagina is painful when it is touched or when there is an attempt at intercourse. Many women with these conditions have difficulty with bedikas as well. They have difficulty inserting tampons, and it's a very difficult condition to have. These women would opt for receiving pleasure manually, certainly, and they would also opt to provide pleasure manually or in other ways or orally in order that they can avoid vaginal penetration.
But at the same time, we know that so many women are afraid of doing these other forms of non-vaginal penetration types of sex because they know that, in their minds at least, it's asur. You're not allowed to spill seed in vein, and in their minds, and with some halachic validity, they'll say spilling seed in vein, meaning non-vaginally, is prohibited by Jewish law. So these questions are acute. They're very, very serious, whether the email that I read, which is about a desire, which is important, to another perhaps more extreme case where they simply can't have vaginal sex. These are very serious questions.
Well, I think that this fear that you're talking about also plays in to the whole experience of pain as a fearful experience, whether there's fear that there be the wasting, so to speak, quote unquote, of semen, or whether there's fear that there's going to be pain. The fear is something that the women have and the men have as well, and that has a lot to do with the way young couples are often educated. And this kind of goes back to sex being a chore, as we've talked about in previous podcasts. The idea that women need to be available for their husbands so that they don't create a condition where they might have a non-vaginal ejaculation, whether it be by masturbating or whether it be even in a dream at night, a nocturnal emission.
Or even in the context of sex, but just non-vaginal sex.
Or even in the context of sex, which is not intercourse-based sex. The idea that the woman is responsible for preventing that failure is something that unfortunately is very common in premarital education, beginning with the wedding night, the anxiety around the wedding night as consummating the marriage as soon as possible in order that the husband does not experience extravaginal emission. And that continues with a general attitude that women are given around the idea that they need to be available for their husbands when their husbands need them. And this is an attitude which often creates a feeling of objectification. It can create trauma as well, because women are in some communities told that they are not allowed to say no. And they really do look at sex as something that is an obligation. And when sex becomes an obligation, and they feel that they have to do it, they will develop the same sort of reaction that people develop when they are sexually molested or abused, because you go into this place of dissociation, freeze, and sex becomes a very, very unfortunate experience over time. And unfortunately, we're not talking enough about sex as being something that needs to be mutually pleasurable. There's little talk about pleasure, or not enough talk about pleasure. And there's little talk about consensual sex as well.
And men, too, can experience this feeling of guilt and anxiety simply because they've been taught all these years about how bad any sort of ejaculation is if it's not done in the context of regular marital intercourse. Reading the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch itself will make people feel that they're going to go to the deepest recesses of hell should they do anything out of normal intercourse. And that can create a tremendous amount of anxiety in their own sexual relationship, as well as their own religious understanding of how Judaism works. It's a problem.
Yeah, it does create a great deal of anxiety. What you're saying is really interesting because very often, women are told that they need to be available for their men's needs. And at the same time, men are told that they have needs. And that's why, when they get married, everything is going to be great. They're going to have an address for their needs. In fact, you just sent me an email last week to show me the Guard Your Eyes website. And on the Guard Your Eyes website, I was looking at it, and I'm familiar with it. I've seen it before. There was a blog, and I read an article on the blog where a young man wrote, "I'm thinking about girls all the time." And the answer was, well, the answer is to marry one. So the message being that once you get married, that struggle that you're having with the need to have a sexual release is going to be there for you. So once women are presented in that objectified way, here is your answer to all of your problems, so to speak, they're going to feel objectified as well.
This leads back to the question that I want to talk about today, both from a halachic and a psychological perspective, the question of shichvat zera levatala, spilling seed in vain, and whether or not doing so in the context of marriage, but not in intercourse, is still considered a wasting of seed. So you asked me what I answered that couple. In order to get there, let me just give a very, very quick read of the Rambam, which we read again in that episode 8. The Rambam in Hilchot Isori Bia 21:9, Parakaf Aleph, Halacha Tet, reads, Ishto shel Adam muteret hilo, a man's wife is allowed to him. Lefichach, therefore, kol ma she'adam rotzeh lasot b'ishto oseh. Anything that a person wants to do with his wife, he may do. Bo'el b'chol eit shirtzeh, he may have intercourse whenever he wants to. Umenashek b'chol ever shirtzeh, he may kiss any part of her body. Uba'aleha ben kedarka, ben shelo kedarka, ben derech evarim, and he may have intercourse with her, whether it's kedarka, and I'll explain these terms, lo kedarka and derech evarim, these three ways. Ubilvad shelo yotzi shichvat zera levatala, as long as he does not spill seed in vain. Ve'afal pichein, and even though this is true, midat chasidut, it is an attribute of piety, shelo yakel adam et rosho lakach, that a person shouldn't make himself lightheaded regarding these matters. In other words, be overly lenient regarding them. V'sheyikadesh atzmo bishat tashmish, and he should, at the same time, sanctify himself when he's together with his wife in an intimate way. So let's not talk about what we talked about in an earlier episode of it's all on the husband, not on the wife. He can do whatever he wants to his wife. Let's deal with the Rambam in terms of the Outercourse issue. The Rambam says here, you can do whatever you want as long as you don't ejaculate non-vaginally. That's what he says. However, as we mentioned in that earlier episode, this is the current Girsa version of the Rambam that we have, but most older manuscripts of the Rambam do not have that line, Ubilvad shelo yotzi shichvat zera levatala, as long as you don't spill seed in vain. And moreover, the Rambam himself, in his commentary on the Mishnah, in discussing this question, does not mention anything about as long as you don't ejaculate. He doesn't mention that at all. The rest he does, which leads many people to believe that this Rambam is not the original version. The original version of the Rambam, he did not have that line in there. That's obviously just one perspective. The Rambam isn't everything. The Raavad, as we mentioned, disagrees with him. And it seems that the two basic trains of thought, the Raavad, who is more prohibitive, and the Rambam, who's more permissive, are reflected in the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah. The Shulchan Aruch, written by Rav Yosef Karo, says you can't really do anything except for regular intercourse. The Ramah says, and this is in Even HaEzer 25:2, he says the exact same thing as the Rambam. And then he says, after quoting that, V'yesh ba'kelim ve'omrim, shemutar shelo kedarka afilu im hosi zera, im oseh ba'akrai. He's allowed to do intercourse shelo kedarka, which means in the abnormal manner, literally. And even if he ejaculates, as long as it is occasionally, ve'no ragil b'kach, and he doesn't do it regularly. So let me explain what these terms mean, and then I can answer the question. The three basic forms of intercourse mentioned are kedarka, shelo kedarka, and derech evarim. Kedarka means normal vaginal intercourse. Shelo kedarka is generally assumed to mean anal intercourse, and derech evarim presumably means every other form of intercourse, whether it's oral sex, whether it would be with a hand, whatever it would be, anything that is not either vaginal or anal. So the Rambam says that a person can do any of these as long as he doesn't ejaculate non-vaginally, but as we see, it's very possible the Rambam actually held that that is not true, that he held you can even do it even if you do ejaculate. The Ramah says that some would be makil, would be lenient, even for anal sex. I want to make a quick correction to something which I said in episode 8. The Ramah said that yesh mekilin, there are those who are lenient and allow ejaculation in the case of sex shelo kedarka, anal intercourse, as long as it's done ba'akrai ve'no ragil bakach, occasionally, and not the couple's normal way of having sexual intercourse. And I said that the Ramah is implying that a person can ejaculate also in derech evarim, other forms of non-vaginal intercourse. And indeed, there are those who understand the Ramah exactly this way. He means that there are those who are lenient and allow a couple to have all forms of non-vaginal intercourse with ejaculation as long as it's occasional. However, there are those who understand the Ramah very differently, and they say that the Ramah is limiting this to anal intercourse, shelo kedarka, and not derech evarim. So I want to clarify that when I said that the Ramah would allow anything, at least according to the yesh mekilin, that is only one way of reading the Ramah. There are those who read the Ramah in a more restrictive manner. The reason that the Ramah might be making a distinction between shelo kedarka, anal intercourse, and derech evarim, other forms of non-vaginal intercourse, is that halachically, shelo kedarka is still technically a form of sexual intercourse with various ramifications halachically, whereas derech evarim is not considered a halachic form of intercourse per se. For that reason, there might be a distinction between the two of them, and that might be why the Ramah specifically singles out shelo kedarka as being an acceptable form of intercourse, as long as it's done occasionally according to those who are lenient, and he might be more machmir, more stringent when it comes to derech evarim. On the other hand, as I mentioned, some do read the Ramah in a more lenient way, in a more permissive way, saying that he would include derech evarim as well, saying that that also may be done occasionally. For a discussion of these and many more issues, I again strongly recommend you read a book written by my friend Rabbi Yaakov Shapiro called Halachic Positions, which discusses all of these issues in great depth. It's an excellent book, and we will have a link to it in the show notes. In any case, though, let me bring it back home to talk about our specific case that the person asked me. Everyone would agree there is a strong strain in Jewish tradition that says ejaculation outside of regular intercourse is not allowed. We can't just pretend that's not there. On the other hand, there are much more permissive and lenient sources when it comes to outercourse, represented by opinions such as the yesh mekilin, the lenient opinion in the Ramah that I quoted, or, for example, the Rambam in his commentary on the Mishnah, and perhaps in the Mishnah Torah, as well as other sources which I have not brought today. All of these sources are more permissive when it comes to outercourse, at least in certain circumstances. So getting back to our question, the question which I was asked about a couple who want to have sex derech evarim while she's pregnant, because that's what her desire is. So there are several ways of approaching this question. I'm going to offer several different answers. One reaction would be that they can do this as long as there's a possibility that later on they will have vaginal intercourse. In other words, they can start off doing this, but as long as it may or may not lead to regular normal intercourse, then they may do this. Another way of looking
What?
That was one answer which I got, which is that you can't do it intentionally knowing that you're going to intentionally spill seed, but you say we can start off with it, and then as long as we say we may or may not do it a certain way, that gives them a certain license to go further. That's obviously a more restrictive way of looking at it. A less restrictive way of looking at it would be to say that if it's really important to them, meaning this is something which she really has a strong desire to do, and the husband obviously is okay with it as well, in that case, then they can do it, but they should do their best to try and make sure that even though he's ejaculating non-vaginally, he should be close to her vagina when he does so, which at least makes it a little more acceptable. That last way is what Rav David Stav suggests in an answer which he gives to a similar question. And finally, I think there's another way of looking at it, which is, depending on the context, maybe it's simply mutar. I think there are those people who would say that in a context like this, it's important to look at all the factors, look at the situation as a whole, and then when you get into some of the questions that you mentioned where people actually have pain, or they can't necessarily have vaginal sex and they want to have some other form of intimacy that involves ejaculation, to me, the phrase, yesh al mi lismoch, there is someone upon whom to rely. I just mentioned the Rambam and the Ramah. That is certainly not an extensive list. There are many other people who say similar ideas or even more lenient ideas. Given that there are other ways of looking at things, I think that when someone really can't have sex in any other way, or even has a strong desire, there's a concept of yesh al mi lismoch. There's someone upon whom we can rely. When it comes to sex, a lot of people, I think, are afraid to use that because of what we mentioned before. There's so much guilt associated with it. The whole idea of causing a stumbling block for the husband, the whole idea of you're going to go to hell if there's a single drop of spilled semen, et cetera, et cetera. People are afraid. Those ideas largely come from Kabbalistic sources, and far be it from me to discount Kabbalistic sources. That's not what I'm trying to do. However, and I'm expecting some listener mail which will not be in my favor, I am willing to discount them when it comes to halacha as opposed to hashkafa and philosophy, and when there's shat hatorach, when it's necessary. When it's necessary, and define as you will, that's really for the couple to decide when it's necessary. When it's necessary, we see there are sources which allow much more than vaginal ejaculation. And given that, I think that if a couple needs that, again, define as you will, they should feel that they're allowed to do that.
Okay. I have some reactions to what you're saying here, and this comes from a very long career dealing with these issues and dealing with rabbis around these issues and dealing with the very strong control that rabbis have in the sex lives of couples who go to them with these questions. Even though you said not to talk about the fact that the Rambam doesn't discuss the woman at all and says that a man can do whatever it is that he wants to his wife. We discussed that in the past, but I do think it's important to bring that up again because it is this sort of cultural way around dealing with issues from the man's point of view that we will lose sight of the woman's body, her autonomy, her desire, her passion, what she would like, what she would not like. So if the halachic discussion is focused on what the man is allowed to do without discussing even what she wants, what is her preference, what does she enjoy, what does she like, what would give her pleasure, then we end up going into more current responsa, even the book by Rav Stav, that also fails to mention the context necessarily. Will say, well, he should try to ejaculate close to the woman's vagina. Well, what if the woman doesn't want him to ejaculate close to her vagina? What if dafka she has pain at the entry to her vagina, which many women with localized provoked vulvodynia have? There can be so many other circumstances that are at play. So what I liked very much about what you said finally at the end, at the end, was, let's leave it to the couple. Yesh al mi lismoch. There are sources we can rely on. And do rabbis need to really be so involved in the intricate details of where the semen is going to go when a couple is having sex?
So are you asking me that question or is that a statement?
Well, you can answer it if you like.
Because I think the answer is they asked, meaning no one's telling them you have to ask the question.
No, well, people ask because there is a general culture around asking questions. I don't mind asking questions if I put my fleishik fork, my meat fork in the dairy dish and I want to understand what to do. And I'm not saying that people shouldn't ask. These are very important questions. Part of what makes me so reactive here is that I also know that some of the answers are destructive. And I have story after story. I know one woman, one couple, she suffered for years from pain with intercourse. They went to a couple rabbis asking them if they could refrain from having intercourse. And the rabbi came back and said, look, I can't find a heter for that. You're going to have to at least get a little bit inside. And of course, the woman developed a great deal of trauma around sex. And what happens with these couples is they actually go into a pattern of avoidance where even if the woman wants to have foreplay or even if she wants to have any kind of intimacy, even a hug, she will avoid. And she will avoid that because she's afraid that any kind of touch is going to lead to intercourse. And that's not what she wants. And this is on a spectrum.
I mean, I hear that this is something which is a problem, not just in this particular topic, obviously. It's a problem when we talk about homosexuality. How can halacha tell anybody who they're allowed to be with, who they're allowed to sleep with? It comes up in almost any context in halacha. If we're going to consider halacha as a normative discipline, in other words, something which is telling people how to act and how to spend every day of their lives and how to deal with the details of their lives, no one is...
Well, you're turning this into something a little bit more global. And I'm not saying that halacha doesn't have a great deal of importance in our day-to-day lives. I'm just saying that there's something here that's being missed out on. And that's the experience of the woman and of the man. Because, by the way, men are put in positions where they are told that they have to choose to have a sexual experience with their wives as opposed to not having that sexual experience if they feel that they're going to have some sort of emission if they don't, which means that they also suddenly have to become the one who has to convince, cajole, attempt, plead, beg, and sometimes even demand. And that is not an experience that most of the men that I have met are interested in doing. Many men feel terrible asking for sex when they know their wife is not in the mood or has pain. And they also don't want to have sex when their wife isn't enjoying it or isn't having pleasure. Yet they believe that they don't have any choice because they're not allowed to have any kind of ejaculation in any other way. So I guess my question for you is, and I know we've talked about masturbation before, and I think that many women in a good marriage, when you're not in the mood, but your husband or your wife, either way, is like really very aroused and really wants to have an experience, that's a good opportunity to use this Outercourse type of stuff. Like, a woman might say, look, I'm really not in the mood to have sex, but I'm happy to give you manual sex, and I don't mind doing that. Then it's consensual, it's mutual. If the woman really doesn't want to do that, she should not have to do that. No woman should have to do anything.
Right.
And, he either lives with it or he doesn't live with it and chooses to do something else. And the question is, what's better? Is it better to, and I kind of asked you this in a different episode, and it was also kind of a rhetorical question, but it's not really a rhetorical question. What would you tell your chatanim when you're teaching them? What would you tell your sons? If your wife is not in the mood, keep convincing her until she's in the mood, or take care of your own needs once in a while, because you can't always rely on her being there for you, especially if she is in pain.
Well, certainly if she's in pain. Obviously, the question is, based on what I already told you, why can't they try some of these other forms of sex? Given that I think that l'shat hatzorech, at the least, when it's necessary, that things like having manual sex or oral sex are permitted.
Well, most of the time, they're not being given that option.
Right, but you're asking me what I would say. So,
okay,
if you ask me what I'm saying, I would say that given that those are allowed, then I think that that's a good option to think about. As I say, yesh al mi lismoch, and I think that's important. You are presenting a very big dilemma for those people who would prohibit that. Or let's even take it according to what I said. Let's say the wife really doesn't want to have that either. Let's say she's not interested in masturbating her husband. Let's say she's not interested in oral sex. And the husband still feels that he really wants to have something and he has to take care of his own needs. That's a tough question. I'm not going to give an answer.
It's really tough. As a matter of fact, I know that there are a lot of people out there listening to this podcast who are getting very reactive because that's exactly what's happening to them. And if you're a man and your wife is just not interested in sex, that's a very difficult position for you to be in. And it's really, really tough. And I think that there are men who are going to be listening, who are really feeling triggered by hearing how hard it is for the woman. It's really hard for the man too. And for a couple like this, who there's a power struggle around sex, then obviously there needs to be
there's got to be a lot more than just it's not just sex anymore.
There's
right.
more going on. And since most couples are interested in preserving and investing and keeping sexual intimacy as an important part of their lives, we're not going to call that particular scenario one that is normative. We don't want to keep going on and on and on and on with this kind of pursuer distancer dynamic where one is always wanting and the other one is never wanting. That's not okay either. That needs to be dealt with. However, there isn't really an entitlement here to whenever you want it, as often as you want it, because I have this need. And when it's used in that way, we also have to look at what's the dynamic in the relationship here.
I would think that if a wife tells her husband that she doesn't want to have any form of intercourse, even derech ibarim, for example, then there's more going on than simply a sex
There's
issue.
always
There's a
more
relationship
going on.
issue,
Yeah,
and that has to be dealt with in that way.
But you see, that's the other thing, is that the rabbis aren't always asking those questions. They sometimes will be asking those questions, and they often will even refer. I get lots of referrals also from clergy members, but sometimes you ask a Rav a question and he gives you an answer and he's telling you what you can and can't do with your wife, and your wife isn't even part of the conversation.
So as a clergyman, I would think that that's a mistake. Let's also make it clear. Very often the wife doesn't want to be part of that conversation. It could be the husband's asking because the wife doesn't feel like. She says, please ask. I don't want to be part of that conversation. I'm embarrassed to ask myself. I've seen cases like that before, numerous times, where a husband will ask me the question on behalf of his wife. She's just not comfortable. That leads to a different issue, which we don't have to get into too much, which certainly I think is very important. There should be more female clergy women. And what I mean by that, whether it's a yoetzet halacha or something else, an address for women to go when they have both halachic and religious questions about sex and anything else, we need to expand that and make it more so. We've talked before how much I think the yoetzot halacha, the kamav nishmat, how incredible that is. I think that has to be a start, not a finish. There has to be much, much more of that. More yoetzot halacha, and they have to be involved in more halachic areas. So certainly that could solve part of the problem, but I'm not going to necessarily blame the husband and the rabbi for talking about a question regarding the wife when the wife simply asks, please, I don't feel comfortable talking to him right now. Because in that case, what else are they supposed to do?
Okay, so the bottom line here, though, is that we need to be able to talk more about couples and sexuality in terms of connection and meaning and what is this about, and less in terms of where every drop of semen is supposed to go. And when we get so involved in where the semen's going to go, we lose sight of what's going on in their marriage, what's going on in the couple, what's going on for the woman, what's going on for the man. And I think that the message that rabbis want to be able to send to the people asking the question is, well, what do you want? What do you like? What feels good for you? What is your, not just here are the dry laws and try to aim for the vagina as much as you can, because that will miss out on what is going on here.
Well, certainly that means that rabbis should be trained better in this particular area. I know that people who go, for example, to Yeshiva University have more than simply halachic training. They also learn all sorts of other things, such as pastoral counseling, etc. In Israel, that's less common, but regardless of what they're learning, they probably should be learning more about sexual health simply as part of their training. I can't say I'm up to date on what they're being taught in particular, but I have a feeling that it isn't as extensive as it probably should be given what you're saying. At the same time, I want to mention another point, Tali, because based on what I'm saying and the permissive ruling, which I offered a few moments ago, saying yesh al mi lismoch, so fine, for me, it's kind of easy to say, yeah, they should be more permissive, but I don't want to deny the fact that there is a strong train of thought within Jewish law, as I mentioned, which is much more restrictive. And I don't want to pretend they're all wrong. I just can't say that. If I'm going to represent halacha on this podcast and try to say what halacha states, there is a strong element of the Shulchan Aruch and the Ravid and others who say you cannot have non-vaginal ejaculation. You just can't. And whereas the way I think the halacha is practically is not like that, I still think for those who hold like that, and if they want to keep halacha, I don't know how they're going to handle it, but I don't want to condemn those rabbis who are asked the question and give a restrictive ruling if that indeed is how they see the halacha, because that's how halacha works. We can say we don't want to follow halacha, but if we're going to follow halacha, and that's the shita, the particular way a particular couple/rabbi looks at something, then I don't think we can condemn the fact that he's ruling the way he believes is true and ask him to say something which he thinks is inaccurate.
Okay. I mean, people should say what they believe they need to say. And I'm going to say what I need to say, because what I need to say is that, I see couples in all stages of life. There are women who are postmenopausal or menopausal, and they're going through all kinds of difficult issues with their bodies. And there are even women who have illnesses. And men, by the way, also have difficulties in their sexual functioning. And when there is a sense of real anxiety around the need to function in a certain specific way, it creates a greater sense of lack of efficacy, lack of self-esteem, feelings of failure, when in fact what we need to be telling couples in these difficult times of life is focus on being together, focus on the connection, focus on pleasure, and let's take the focus off of the performance. And when we come along and we say, look, do whatever you want, but make sure that you ejaculate in this certain way, we are adding a great deal of anxiety. We're also adding anxiety. If a woman has a certain reactive tightness or anxiety around penetration, and we tell the couple, do whatever you want, but if you feel like you're going to ejaculate, make sure to aim for the vagina, and she's not ready for that. And she doesn't feel the autonomy to be able to say, wait, stop, I'm not ready. And he's really concerned that he's going to ejaculate and he's got to do it anyway. Then we are creating a great struggle where we are saying the semen going into the vagina is more important than this poor woman's trauma that she's experiencing.
So I definitely agree with that. And I'm going to go even further. And I'm not going to retract what I said before, but I'm going to say the other side of the coin, which is that the reason that I believe a permissive ruling is apropos in this context is exactly because of what you're saying. Even though I will acknowledge that those halachic scholars who have a restrictive ruling are coming from a good place and that's what they believe and they should say what they believe, I do think that it's important to have the knowledge that such permissive rulings do exist so that we can utilize them. Here's why I think that they should try and be more open to the idea that the Rambam, as we understand him in the Perush Shalom Mishnayot, where he's more lenient, and the other opinions that say similarly, we should utilize them, and that we might be really making a mistake by not opening ourselves up to that concept of relying on the lenient opinions in this case.
I'm happy that you were able to relate to what I said and kind of push the lenient ruling because of that. I really believe that most rabbis, when they give these rulings, they are not aware of the effect of these rulings because they don't know what can happen with these couples. I just had a couple where they're several years after they first got married. I had seen them in the beginning and then I'm seeing them again now. And he was told by the rabbi who taught him, who said to him literally, for his wedding night, she's going to probably scream in pain, but still push through.
Oy vavoy.
And I didn't only hear this once. I've heard this many, many times. Still push through. The message being, it's very difficult to get through, and even if she screams in pain, keep pushing through. I have a word for that, and this is something that unfortunately is very common.
Yeah, that's very scary. That's really scary.
It's happening. It's out there.
My friend Yaakov Shapiro, who wrote that book I mentioned before, Halachic Positions, What Judaism Really Says About Passion in the Marital Bed, I once talked to him and I said, no, this book is so important because he offers the lenient rulings and explains where they come from. And I say, in this day and age, etc. And he said, no. It's not true because of this day and age. It's true because that's the halacha. I think people just get it wrong. So he actually understands this, and he's done research in this probably more than anybody I've ever met. He says the halacha really is the lenient halacha. That's far more understandable, far more compelling from the halachic sources than the more restrictive ruling. I think that people are just terrified, if I can say so, of the Zohar. They're really afraid of what the mystical sources say about how every drop of semen is a potential human life, which, while true on some level, is not the way we understand it biologically anymore. And therefore, these are all souls that are not going to be created, et cetera, et cetera. I am guessing, without knowing for sure, that people hear that and the idea of allowing someone to ejaculate non-vaginally, it's like, whoa, that's a big thing to allow given what the sources say. I'm not discounting the Zohar again. I'm not trying to say that. But I do think that its impact on halacha should be limited when it comes to something like this.
I think that it doesn't have to be black and white. I think that we can appreciate that there is some sort of mystical meaning to semen, that it has a certain energy, it's life's force and life's energy, and there is a value. I think that in other cultures, that's also present. There isn't a value to the preservation of semen. However, is a drop or two of semen more valuable than a living, breathing woman who might be suffering because of this need to be a container, be a vessel, and nothing more?
Yeah, that's a big problem. And that has to be considered when we think about the quote-unquote potential life that you correctly say. Across cultures, people look at semen in that way versus the actual life of somebody's wife who is suffering. And despite the fact that we respect our mystical sources, they bring great truths. The impact upon halacha and practice has to be limited, or else I think we're just making a mistake.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I think that it sort of seems like common sense, but unfortunately, it's not. It seems that many, many couples are taught as one of the first things that they know is the most important creed of sexual life. Don't spill seed in vain. And it's a continuation of the prohibition against masturbation, but it continues into marriage as acknowledging and appreciating intercourse as the only legitimate way to release. And that, of course, makes a man dependent on his wife for that own legitimate way to release. Now, ideally, that shouldn't be a problem. I think that, that could create a very ideal, nice situation where two people depend and rely on one another for mutual satisfaction without extra needs. But unfortunately, people's sex drives are not always completely at the same place. And there are, like we said before, different times of life and different scenarios that could make being able to always accommodate each other in that way difficult. And we have to be able to treat this with a sense of humanity and not just look at the dry halacha.
And as the Ramah says, "Af al pi shu mutar b'kol eila," even though all of this is allowed, anyone who sanctifies himself by not doing that which is allowed is considered a holy person. But that doesn't mean everyone has an obligation to be a holy person.
Well, people will read that and they'll say, look, I want to be a holy person. So my missus, I have to tell her that she's got to let me be a holy person. There are people out there who live their lives that way.
I think, Tali, what you said about things not being black and white is really the crux of the issue, because we're not going to deny, and even though I mentioned a permissive ruling before, I'm not going to deny that the Ramah still says ba'akrai. It should be when necessary as opposed to a couple's main form of sexual intercourse. The idea of being a sanctified person is a real concept. Let's not deny it. That has to be balanced with the needs of both the husband and the wife in any given context. And I think the couple have to make sure they have real communication. They talk to each other. They decide how much they want to let the rabbi into their bedroom, so to speak. That's an important element as well. Obviously, my perspective is that halacha should be the dominant legal framework for a person's life and for a couple's life. I'm not denying that at all. But the couple should make sure they're on the same page regarding this so that they can have a strong marriage, and that when they do discuss sexual issues with a rabbi or anyone else, or even just look in the books, that they're both on the same page about what they're trying to look for, what they want to get out of it.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Tali, when I was researching this episode, looking up some of the halachic sources, I was relying in part on the book Avo Beitecha by Rav David Stav and his son Rav Avram Stav. And in the essay, which deals specifically with non-vaginal intercourse, he actually footnotes you. Yes.
He's footnoting a paper that I wrote for the publication Kolech. In Hebrew, it is Ani Kli Sharet Biyado, and in English, there's an English translation. Actually, I wrote it in English, and the Hebrew is a translation. I am his vessel, influence of male ejaculatory restrictions on women's sexual autonomy in Orthodox Jewish marriage. And as long as you bring up the paper, which I think we'll put in the show notes, I have a few little vignettes in the paper of the experiences of some of the women, and I'll read them to you. They're pretty short. Sometimes after a long day with the kids and working, I'm just so tired. I'm afraid he will ask to be together, and if he does, you are really not allowed to say no. And with nursing, I feel dry and intercourse is painful. I really wouldn't mind doing it with my hand, but I know that isn't allowed. Another vignette. When my husband was learning in the Kollel, his Rav said that we should do it twice a week, which was okay. Now he has a job, and his Rav said that since he sees women at work, this makes him have a greater Yetzer Hara, so we should have relations 3 or 4 times a week. Since I'm in my 8th month already, and I already have 2 little kids, this can get very hard. But what can I do? I wouldn't want him have a kishalon or a failure because of me. And one more. I know that on mikveh night, I'm supposed to want to have sex, but after 2 weeks of no physical contact, I really need some time to get used to it again. I wish we could just cuddle and take our time, but he gets so excited so quickly that we have to have intercourse before I'm ready, and then I feel like I have to be his vessel.
Well, this all explains some of the aspects that you were talking about before, where using this concept of Yesh Alamid Lismoch is appropriate, I would think. to be able to figure out when one can be lenient in the sense of allowing outercourse. I don't want anyone listening to take away from me that I'm saying, yes, outercourse is always allowed in every context. I am not saying that. What I am saying is that given shat hatzorech, if a couple decides this is something which is important for them, given the necessity, and that's for them to decide, whatever that means is really up to them, then I think this should be an important factor in thinking about it, that there are more lenient opinions. That at the very least, should take away the strong guilt factor and should also hopefully open up couples to the possibility of doing things that will not, God forbid, cause pain to the wife or to the husband for that matter, to allow them to be able to have sexual closeness in ways other than regular normal intimacy, regular normal intercourse, that will be halakhically sanctioned, and at the same time doesn't necessarily force the husband to go and control himself to a degree which he finds impossible.
It would be helpful for all rabbis to be more aware of this. I'm going to read you just one more scenario because I'd like you to comment on it if you heard something like this.
Okay.
You know, I can't make this stuff up. I described in the paper the case of a Hasidic couple where she was able to enjoy foreplay, but the moment that her husband tried to penetrate, she would tighten up and she would get very afraid. And we did work through that there were some trauma issues, not from the marriage, but from before the marriage. Because as I said many times, trauma can be created in the marriage itself. And for therapeutic reasons, she needed to be able to create safety in order to heal from her trauma. She needed to have this feeling because she was abused in the past. She needed to have this feeling of full autonomy. And so she needed to be able to tell her husband at any given point that he should stop. If she needed him to stop, that he should stop. She was having intercourse with him, but she would experience severe nausea and she would be very sick afterwards for days. So we knew that the treatment would have to involve the opportunity for Sarah Malka to experience her husband as someone safe. So she would have to learn that she could establish boundaries on herself and that her body would be respected. She had been abused. The experience of somebody who's abused is that anybody can do whatever they want with my body. It's not mine, and you develop this lack of autonomy. It robs you of your basic sense of self. So in order to get that back, she had to be able to have a kind of tikkun, so to speak, a chavaya metakenet, and several experiences where she could really experience sex as a very safe place. And
she had her autonomy.
She had her autonomy and she had her boundaries, and she would say no, and she would actually be able to be listened to. Her husband was told that before touching her in any way, he should ask for her consent and only touch her if she agrees. At later stages, when she was more ready for intercourse, he was instructed to ask her first if it was okay to try to penetrate, and would only penetrate if she would give verbal agreement. So Sarah Malka's husband, Chaim, explained that he really wanted to cooperate, but he had to speak to his Rav before agreeing. And the Rav heard the situation, and he said the following: unless intercourse was a clear option, no intimate touch should take place between the couple, lest he become aroused and then have no outlet. Therefore, the safe touch that we were trying to establish could take place, but only as long as intercourse would occur at the end anyway, which clearly defeated the whole purpose of the exercise.
Right.
So
that's the opposite of what's supposed to happen.
So regarding the intercourse, the husband should ask permission, like the therapist said to do. However, if he feels he is going to ejaculate, he still needs to be able to ejaculate at the entry, even if, she's not ready for penetration, which probably would have completely reenacted her trauma. And then the rabbi went on to explain that when a person is hungry and knows that there's bread in his basket, pat b'salo, he can control his hunger. He needs to be reassured that his wife will be in his basket, basically, was his point.
So what's your question for me about this?
Well, what do you think about that?
I am not happy with the rabbi's answer.
And what would you say if the scenario came to you?
So my first answer would be, I would wait till the scenario comes to me, which sounds obvious, but what I mean is that I'm not imposing my opinion on anybody else. In other words, if they're not asking me, that's up to them. If they decide to ask me the question, however, in that case, I would say that they should do exactly what the therapist said. I mean, I think given everything that I've said in this episode, that shouldn't be a surprising answer.
And that should be the job of the rabbi, to reduce the anxiety and not add to it.
I will add that if, again, I don't know the scenario beyond what you just told me, if in principle she was perfectly okay with him trying to aim towards the vagina at the end, in theory, and that doesn't undermine anything that the therapist is trying to accomplish or what she's trying to accomplish in regaining her autonomy. In theory, sure, that if you can do that, I wouldn't discourage that. I would encourage it. In fact, that's a better way to do it if you can avoid, if it's not a problem for the larger.
What's important for the rabbis to also know is that often a woman who has been abused will say yes, but she's really not able to say no. And I guess that's where my protection comes in as the therapist, because the rabbi might say, do you mind if, and she might just shake her head yes, because her ability to say no was not developed because of her being a victim of abuse.
So then I'm going to amend my answer. In an ideal world, a rabbi really has to be familiar not only with the theoretical issues, but also with the specific therapeutic necessity of this case. So if she consents, I would suggest and recommend that the rabbi speak to the therapist. Obviously, there are privacy issues, but on some level, this is a conundrum because we're asking the rabbi to rule on a very specific issue that involves therapy, but he may not be familiar with what the therapy entails. So in order for him to give a proper answer, he really needs to talk to the person who knows more than anybody else about what the therapy includes, either the couple themselves in a very honest session or the therapist herself.
I've spoken with rabbis several times, but in the cases of very traumatized women, I need to be on their side. And sometimes I might be able to say, is it okay to talk to a rabbi? And they'll say, yeah, sure, but it's really not. So it's a little bit complex.
Better training for people who are involved in these questions is paramount.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you probably were a bit surprised by some of the stories that I had. And I think that we do need to acknowledge that what I'm seeing are clinical samples. And we are not talking about clinical samples, but we are talking about the possibility of these kinds of conditions. And so when we talk about the best way to have sex or the frommest way to have sex or the most machmer or the lechatchila way to have sex, we do need to appreciate that it's not just about being the frommest and most halachic. There are other possible factors here that should be considered.
Tali, you assume that I am surprised by some of the stories that you mentioned, and that's certainly a reasonable assumption. However, the reality is that a year and a half ago, I would have been surprised. But ever since you and I started this podcast together, and since we've begun receiving communications from our listeners, I'm not surprised because our listeners are very, very honest with us and have really provided tremendous feedback and have given real stories that show that they care deeply about Judaism. Obviously, the people who write to us have different levels of halachic observance, but the fact that they care about these issues shows that Judaism is very important to them, halacha is important to them, Torah is important to them, and they're troubled by some of the contradictions and difficulties in balancing that love for Judaism and respect and adherence to halacha with their sexual needs. And I certainly hope that this podcast strikes that proper balance between accepting halacha as normative and presenting a very, very positive and respectful view of Torah and halacha, while at the same time simultaneously being respectful of the genuine concerns and conundrums and needs of people who are dealing with issues in sexuality. So Tali, I thank you for this episode. I really appreciate everything you brought to the table. And I hope that the halachic presentation, which I offered today, brief as it was, is also helpful to people.
And thank you.
Thank you all for listening to this episode of Intimate Judaism. Please go to intimatejudaism.com and you'll see the show notes for this episode, which will include a link to Tali's article, I Am His Vessel, along with all the sources mentioned on this podcast, there in full. Remember to continue writing to us at intimatejudaism@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's intimatejudaism@jewishcoffeehouse.com. And finally, please remember as much as possible to share this podcast. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.